Welcome to the Hidden Library. Tonight, we unseal another forgotten volume of mystery, A Cry in the Candlelight. On a mist-shrouded October evening in St. Mary Mead, a terrified scream pierces the night, leading Miss Marple to a shuttered house, a single burning candle, and a secret that refuses to die. If you cherish mysteries born of shadow and silence, subscribe now. Your support keeps the lamps burning in the Hidden Library. Before we begin, share in the comments where you're listening from. Your words illuminate the dark corridors of the Hidden Library. Now, settle in by the fire, let the fog curl around the windows, and join Miss Marple as she unravels A Cry in the Candlelight. Chapter 1. The Cry. The October evening had drawn in early, as it does in that uncertain season when summer lingers reluctantly and autumn waits to claim its due. A fine mist hung over St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of cottage gardens and lending an almost spectral quality to the lamplit windows along the high street. In the vicarage drawing room, the parish meeting had reached that comfortable stage where discussion had given way to the pleasant ritual of tea and conversation. Miss Marple sat in her accustomed chair near the window, her knitting needles moving with their customary gentle precision. She was not, perhaps, attending with her full concentration to Mrs. Price's rather lengthy dissertation on the subject of the church jumble sale, for her gaze had drifted more than once to the darkening scene beyond the lace curtains. There was something in the quality of the evening that made one think of old tales, of lights in empty houses and footsteps on deserted paths. "I really cannot see why we should not hold it on the 23rd, Mrs. Price was saying with some warmth. "It has always been the 23rd. "Perhaps," suggested the vicar's wife mildly, "we might consider the convenience of those who must travel from—" She broke off. They all heard it. A cry, faint but unmistakable, carrying across the damp air with peculiar clarity. It was a woman's voice, distant yet somehow immediate, filled with a terror that made the comfortable drawing room seem suddenly fragile, a thin shell of warmth and light against the gathering darkness. Miss Marple's hands stilled on her knitting. Mrs. Price's teacup halted halfway to her lips. Even the vicar, who had been standing by the fireplace with his back to the room, turned sharply. "Good heavens," he said. "What was that?" For a moment, no one answered. Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved to the window, peering out into the mist. The cry had come from the direction of the lane, the old lane that led past the churchyard towards what had once been the more prosperous end of the village. "It sounded," said Miss Marple quietly, "rather like someone in distress." "From Carisbrook Way," added a voice from the doorway. They turned to see Martha Briggs, who had been helping in the kitchen. Her face was pale, her hand clutching the door frame. "I heard it clear as anything. That was from old Carisbrook House, that was." "But the house is empty," objected Mrs. Price. "It has been empty these 2 years, ever since the Colonel died abroad." "Empty or not," said Martha Briggs stubbornly, "that cry came from that direction, and well I should know, living as I do just along the lane." The vicar had already moved towards the hall. "We had better investigate, Miss Marple. Perhaps you would be good enough to—" But Miss Marple was already reaching for her shawl. "I think we all heard it quite distinctly," she said, "though sounds can travel in peculiar ways on a misty evening." They emerged into the damp October night, a small procession led by the vicar's lantern. The Reverend Paul Denham, the young curate, had appeared from the direction of his lodgings and joined them, his face anxious in the lamplight. With them, too, was Eleanor Bryce, who had been calling at the vicarage and now fell into step beside Miss Marple. "How very strange," Miss Bryce said. Her voice was low and troubled. "Old Carisbrook House. I had not thought, that is, I did not suppose anyone would be there." Miss Marple glanced at her with interest. Eleanor Bryce had returned to St. Mary Mead only recently after many years abroad. In India, it was said, though the circumstances of her return were wrapped in that particular kind of village mystery that consists of much speculation and few facts. "You knew the Carisbrooks, I believe," Miss Marple ventured. "I knew them. Yes, a long time ago." Eleanor Bryce's tone did not encourage further inquiry. They had reached the point where the lane curved past the churchyard wall. Old Carisbrook House stood back from the road, its considerable bulk just visible through the mist. It was a substantial property, built in the last century by Colonel Carisbrook's grandfather, and it had about it that air of reproachful emptiness that seems to cling to houses that have been suddenly abandoned. The vicar raised his lantern higher. The others pressed closer, their breath visible in the cold air. For a long moment they stood in silence, listening. But there was nothing. No sound, save the faint drip of moisture from the leaves and the distant bark of a dog. "Perhaps," began Mrs. Price hopefully, "it was merely—" "Look there," said Martha Briggs sharply. "The window, the upper window." They looked. In one of the upper rooms, faint but unmistakable, there flickered a light, the uncertain, wavering glow of a candle. "Someone is in the house," whispered Eleanor Bryce. Miss Marple, standing quietly beside her, observed that Miss Bryce's hands were trembling. "We should investigate at once," said the Reverend Denham. His voice was firm, but something in his manner suggested a reluctance he could not quite conceal. "In the morning," said the vicar with decision. "We shall investigate properly in the morning. It would be foolhardy to enter an empty house in darkness. If someone is there, and clearly someone is, they will still be there at first light." They stood a moment longer, watching as the candlelight moved across the window and then disappeared. The house returned to darkness, brooding and silent. Miss Marple found herself thinking of other empty houses, other mysterious lights, other cries in the night that had heralded darker things. But she said nothing, merely drew her shawl more closely about her shoulders as they turned back towards the vicarage. The October mist seemed to have grown thicker, and the comfortable lights of the village had never seemed so very far away. Chapter 2. Old Carisbrook House. The morning brought one of those peculiarly English autumn days when the mist, instead of lifting, seemed merely to settle more determinedly over the landscape. By 9 o'clock, a small group had assembled outside Old Carisbrook House. The vicar, Miss Marple, Inspector Slack, who had motored out from Much Benham, Martha Briggs, still pale from the previous evening's alarm, and Mr. Geoffrey Linton, the estate agent who managed the property. Mr. Linton was a man of perhaps 40, with the sort of easy, pleasant manner that comes naturally to those whose profession requires them to be agreeable. He had arrived in something of a rush, his motor car having given him trouble on the way. "Dreadful business," he said, producing a key from his waistcoat pocket, "though I expect there's some quite simple explanation. Perhaps Mrs. Carisbrook herself, though I understood she was abroad." "Mrs. Carisbrook," said Inspector Slack sharply. "The Colonel's widow?" Yes. The house has been empty since the Colonel's death 2 years ago. Mrs. Carisbrook inherited, naturally, but she has never lived here. Indeed, I rather understood she was traveling on the continent." The key turned in the lock with a protesting screech. Mr. Linton pushed, and the heavy oak door swung inward. The smell that greeted them was the characteristic odor of a house long shut up, damp and dust and the faint musty scent of rooms where no fire has been lit for many months. The entrance hall was large and gloomy, with a handsome staircase rising to the upper floors. Dust sheets covered what furniture remained. Their footsteps echoed on the tiled floor, and Inspector Slack's torch sent long shadows dancing across the walls. It was Martha Briggs who saw her first. Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a cry. There, at the foot of the stairs, lay the figure of a woman, still in her traveling coat. Beside her outstretched hand, burned down to a stub, was a candle in a pewter holder. Inspector Slack moved forward with professional swiftness, bending over the body. After a moment he straightened. "Dead some hours," he said quietly. A fall, by the look of it. Came down the stairs in the dark, I should say. Miss Marple had moved closer, her keen eyes taking in the scene with that peculiar attention she brought to such matters. The woman was perhaps 50, well-dressed, her grey hair neatly arranged beneath a small hat. Her face bore an expression that might have been either fear or surprise. "Mrs. Carisbrook," confirmed Mr. Linton, his voice shaken. "I would know her anywhere, though I have not seen her these 2 years. Good heavens, this is terrible. What could she have been doing here?" "That," said Inspector Slack heavily, "is what we shall need to discover. Mr. Linton, when did you last visit this property?" "A week ago, perhaps 10 days. I make regular inspections, you understand. The house must be kept weatherproof." Miss Marple had been examining the candle with interest. It was burned down almost to nothing, the wax having run in uneven rivulets down one side. She bent closer, observing how the wax had pooled and set in a curious pattern, as though the candle had been carried while tilted at an angle. "Inspector," she said mildly, "I wonder if I might make an observation." Inspector Slack, who had dealt with Miss Marple before and knew better than to dismiss her apparently innocent remarks, nodded curtly. "This candle," continued Miss Marple, "appears to have burned in rather an unusual manner, almost as though it had been carried while someone was running or moving very quickly." The vicar had wandered into the drawing-room, where dust sheets draped the furniture in ghostly fashion. He called out suddenly, "I say, here's rather an odd thing. One of these chairs has been moved, turned about, you see, to face away from the door." They joined him. Indeed, one straight-backed chair stood in peculiar isolation near the window, positioned as though whoever had sat in it had wished to watch the lane outside whilst remaining concealed from anyone entering the room. Inspector Slack frowned. "Odd," he admitted. He moved to the windows, examining the catches. All were securely fastened from the inside. Mr. Linton had remained in the hall, and now he called out in some excitement, "Inspector, there's something here on the desk. A letter, I think." The desk stood in a small alcove beneath the stairs. Upon its leather surface lay a sheet of notepaper, the ink still dark and fresh. Miss Marple read over the inspector's shoulder. "My dearest Eleanor, I cannot keep silent any longer." There it ended, the sentence unfinished, the pen having been laid aside in evident haste. "Eleanor Bryce," murmured the vicar. "She was with us last night. An old friend of the family, I believe." "We shall need to speak with her," said Inspector Slack, carefully folding the letter. "Mr. Linton, I must ask you to remain available for questioning. Miss Briggs, you as well. This house must be secured and properly examined." Martha Briggs began to weep quietly. "I told them I seen a shadow at the window. Last month when I came to do my airing, I seen something moving up in that front bedroom." But Mr. Linton said as it was my imagination. Mr. Linton's pleasant face had gone rather white. "I assure you, Martha, I dismissed your concern only because houses do seem to hold shadows when they stand empty. I meant no harm." Miss Marple had moved away from the group and now stood at the foot of the staircase, looking upward into the dimness of the upper hall. The dust on the treads showed a confusion of footprints. At least 2 sets, she thought, perhaps more. But there was something else that caught her attention, something about the way the dust had been distributed, as though someone had walked up and down these stairs repeatedly before the final, fatal encounter. The morning light, filtering weakly through the begrimed windows, seemed to emphasize rather than dispel the gloom that hung over old Carisbrook House. Miss Marple found herself thinking of last night's cry, that terrible, terrified cry that had echoed through the October darkness. Mrs. Carisbrook's last sound, surely. But why had she cried out? A simple fall would not produce such terror. Unless, of course, she had seen something, or someone, that had frightened her very badly indeed. She glanced once more at the unfinished letter, at the chair that faced the wrong way, at the candle that had burned so strangely. Accidents, in Miss Marple's long experience, rarely left such a collection of curious details in their wake. Chapter 3. Shadows and Secrets. News of Mrs. Carisbrook's death spread through St. Mary Mead with that peculiar rapidity which characterizes village life. By midday, Miss Marple had received no fewer than 3 callers, each ostensibly come upon some trifling errand, but each transparently eager to discuss the tragedy at old Carisbrook House. Miss Marple, her knitting progressing steadily in her lap, listened with the appearance of gentle absorption while her visitors spoke. Mrs. Price, arriving first with a request for advice on the vicarage flower arrangements, had been full of speculation. "Dreadful, quite dreadful," she had declared, though one cannot help but wonder what brought the poor woman back after all this time. 2 years, was it not, since the Colonel died, and never a visit to St. Mary Mead in all that time. Most peculiar. "People do have their reasons," Miss Marple had murmured, her needles clicking softly. It was Mrs. Hartwell, the doctor's wife, who provided more substantial information. She had called ostensibly to return a borrowed recipe book, but her real purpose became evident almost immediately. "Dr. Lloyd was called to the house this morning," she confided, lowering her voice, though they were quite alone in Miss Marple's sitting room. "Inspector Slack particularly requested it. Of course, my husband cannot speak of professional matters, but I could not help noticing that he seemed rather troubled when he returned." "Indeed," said Miss Marple mildly. "How distressing for him. And Mr. Geoffrey Linton, you know him, I expect, the estate agent. Such a charming man, always so pleasant when one sees him about the village. But I have heard—" She paused delicately. Miss Marple waited with an air of polite interest. "I've heard that his business is not doing quite as well as one might suppose. My husband's clerk mentioned something about gambling debts, though I am sure I should not repeat such things." "Human nature being what it is," observed Miss Marple, "one does sometimes find that those who appear most prosperous are, in reality, rather pressed for funds. It reminds me rather of young Arthur Digby, who used to work at the bank here in the village. Always very well dressed, very agreeable. But it turned out he had been helping himself from the till for years." Mrs. Hartwell leaned forward eagerly. "You think Mr. Linton—" "Oh, my dear, I think nothing at all," said Miss Marple firmly. "I merely observe that appearances can be deceptive." After Mrs. Hartwell had departed, Miss Marple sat for some time in thoughtful silence. Then, with the air of one who has made a decision, she put aside her knitting and reached for her hat and coat. A visit to the Blue Boar, she thought, might prove instructive. Eleanor Bryce was staying there, and Miss Marple had a perfectly legitimate errand in that direction. She had promised to take some preserves to Mrs. Bantry, whose house lay just beyond the inn. The Blue Boar was a respectable establishment, much favoured by commercial travellers and the occasional visitor to St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple found Eleanor Bryce in the small residence lounge, a book lying unread in her lap, her face pale and drawn. "My dear Miss Bryce," said Miss Marple gently, "I do hope you will forgive the intrusion. I heard you were staying here, and I wondered if there was anything I might do to help. This dreadful business about poor Mrs. Carisbrook must have been such a shock to you." Eleanor Bryce looked up, and Miss Marple observed that her eyes were red as though from weeping. She was a woman of perhaps 45, handsome in a rather faded way, with dark hair touched with grey and an air of genteel poverty about her clothing. "It is kind of you to call," she said in a low voice. "I have been sitting here trying to understand it. Lydia, Mrs. Carisbrook and I were school friends, you see. We had not seen each other for many years, but we had lately resumed correspondence." "Had you?" said Miss Marple with interest. "Then perhaps she mentioned to you that she intended to visit St. Mary Mead." "No, that is—" Eleanor Bryce hesitated. "She wrote to me 3 weeks ago. She was in London," she said, "and she wished to see me." She asked if I would come to St. Mary Mead. I'd only just returned from India, you understand, and I thought perhaps Lydia might help me. I'd been companion to a lady in Calcutta, but she died and I found myself rather at a loss. Her voice trembled slightly, and Miss Marple made a small sympathetic sound. So you came to St. Mary Mead, but Mrs. Carisbrook had not yet arrived. Precisely. I've been waiting here nearly a fortnight. I received a telegram from her last week saying she had been delayed but would come shortly. And then this terrible thing happened. Most distressing, agreed Miss Marple. You had known the Colonel as well, I suppose? A curious expression crossed Eleanor Bryce's face. Something that might have been fear or perhaps merely deep unease. I knew him. Yes. A long time ago before his marriage. There was a time when I thought, but it came to nothing, he married Lydia instead. She spoke with difficulty, as though the memory pained her still. And you went to India? Eventually, yes. After various things. One must make one's way in the world, Miss Marple. I had no family, no fortune. I was fortunate to secure the position in Calcutta. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And yet Mrs. Carisbrook wished to see you. Had she perhaps some particular purpose in mind? Eleanor Bryce's hands twisted together in her lap. She wrote that she needed my help. She said... She broke off, seeming to struggle with herself. She said she had discovered something about her husband's death. Something terrible. She needed to speak with someone who had known them both, who could advise her. I was the only person she felt she could trust. This was indeed interesting. Miss Marple's knitting needles, had she been holding them, would have paused in their rhythm. Did she give you any indication of what she had discovered? No, she said it was too dangerous to commit to paper. She would tell me everything when we met. Eleanor Bryce looked up, her eyes dark with something that might have been fear. And now she is dead, Miss Marple. Dead before she could tell me anything. It seems almost as though someone did not wish her to speak. Miss Marple walked home slowly through the autumn afternoon, her mind turning over what she had learned. The afternoon light was fading early, as it does in October, and the shadows lay long across the village green. She thought about the letter. My dearest Eleanor, I cannot keep silent any longer. And about Eleanor Bryce's frightened face. At the post office, she encountered Martha Briggs, who was just emerging with a parcel under her arm. The former housekeeper looked haggard, her eyes still showing signs of recent tears. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said with evident relief at seeing a familiar face. "I have been that upset, I cannot tell you. To think of poor Mrs. Carisbrook lying there all alone in that dark house." "You had continued to care for the house, I understand," said Miss Marple gently. "Once a month, regular as clockwork, I went in to air the rooms and check for damp. Mr. Linton, he arranged it all, said as how the house must be kept proper, though when Mrs. Carisbrook would return, no one could say." "And you noticed nothing unusual on your visits?" Martha Briggs hesitated, her face troubled. "There was something, Miss Marple, though Mr. Linton said as I was being fanciful. About a month ago, when I went to do my airing, I could have sworn someone had been in the Colonel's study. Nothing was taken, mind you, but there was a drawer in his desk. It had been forced open. The lock was broken. I told Mr. Linton, but he said as it must have been like that for ages, and I just hadn't noticed before." "But you did not think so?" "No, Miss Marple, I did not. I knew that house inside and out, and that drawer had been locked tight when last I looked at it." Miss Marple thanked her and continued homeward, her mind working methodically through the puzzle that was taking shape. A forced drawer, a frightened friend, an unfinished letter, and a death that might not be an accident after all. And somewhere in this tangle, she felt certain, lay a secret that someone had been desperate to conceal. The October evening was drawing in once more, and the mist was rising from the meadows beyond the church. Miss Marple quickened her pace, suddenly eager to be home before the darkness fell completely. There was something about this case, she reflected, that brought to mind other cases, other secrets kept too long in the dark. And secrets, in her experience, had a way of becoming dangerous when someone tried to bring them to light. Chapter 4. A Murder, Most Foul. Dr. Haydock returned to St. Mary Mead on the evening of the second day following the discovery of Mrs. Carisbrook's body. He had been visiting his sister in Bournemouth and arrived home to find an urgent message requesting his presence at the police station in Much Benham. He drove there immediately, his curiosity thoroughly aroused. Inspector Slack greeted him with barely concealed relief. The inspector was a man who preferred certainties, and the Carisbrook case had been giving him a distinct sense of unease since the previous morning when Miss Marple had paid him a visit. "I want a second opinion, Doctor," Slack said without preamble. "You know the case, I expect. Mrs. Carisbrook, found dead at the foot of the stairs at Old Carisbrook House. Dr. Griffiths examined the body and certified death by misadventure. A fall in the darkness, but Miss Marple has been suggesting. Well, I want you to look at the body yourself." Dr. Haydock, who knew Miss Marple well and respected her judgment considerably more than Inspector Slack did, felt his interest sharpen. He accompanied the inspector to where Mrs. Carisbrook's body had been taken and conducted a thorough examination. When he straightened up, his face was grave. "Well?" demanded Inspector Slack. "Miss Marple was quite right to have doubts," said Dr. Haydock slowly. "These injuries are not consistent with a simple fall. Look here, these bruises on the shoulders. They were made by hands, Inspector. Someone gripped her hard and pushed her with considerable force. Moreover, judging by the extent of rigor mortis and other factors, I would say she died several hours before she was found, most likely the previous evening around the time that cry was heard." Inspector Slack's face darkened. "Murder, then?" "I'm afraid so. And what is more, whoever did this attempted to make it appear an accident. A rather clumsy attempt, actually, if one examines the evidence carefully." The inspector's mind was already racing ahead to the implications. "We'll need to re-examine that house from top to bottom, and I'll want to question everyone who had any connection with the deceased." By midday the following day, Old Carisbrook House had been transformed into a scene of intense police activity. Inspector Slack had brought in additional men from Much Benham, and they moved through the dusty rooms with methodical thoroughness. What they discovered only deepened the mystery. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, the front room with the window that overlooked the lane, there were clear signs that someone had spent considerable time there. A chair had been positioned to allow a view of anyone approaching the house, and cigarette ash was found on the windowsill. The dust patterns on the floor told their own story. Someone had paced back and forth, waiting. "Waited for her," said Inspector Slack grimly. "Knew she was coming, and got here first." In the drawing room, the peculiarly positioned chair yielded another clue. Upon its seat was found a small quantity of candle wax, suggesting that whoever had sat there had done so while holding a candle, perhaps watching, perhaps listening for sounds in the house. But it was in the hallway, near the writing desk, that Miss Marple made her own contribution to the investigation. She had accompanied Inspector Slack at his reluctant invitation, and she stood now by the desk, her head slightly tilted as though listening to something only she could hear. "Inspector," she said presently, "might I make an observation?" Slack grunted his assent. "There is a scent here, very faint but distinctive. Bay rum, I believe. A gentleman's cologne, rather an unusual one these days." Inspector Slack sniffed but could detect nothing. However, he made a note of it. The unfinished letter to Eleanor Bryce was examined more closely. The ink was fresh. The pen had been laid down in evident haste. The paper was of good quality, the handwriting firm and clear until the last word, which trailed off slightly, as though the writer had been interrupted. "My dearest Eleanor," read Inspector Slack aloud, "I cannot keep silent any longer." "About what?" he muttered. "That's what we need to know." Mr. Petherick, the solicitor, arrived in response to the inspector's summons and provided information that cast the case in an entirely new light. He confirmed what village gossip had already hinted at. Colonel Carisbrook's will had contained an unusual provision. The entire estate was left to Mrs. Carisbrook, explained Mr. Petherick, settling his spectacles on his nose, on the condition that she remain in England for 2 full years following her husband's death. If she left the country during that period for more than 30 days in total, the estate would pass to Colonel Carisbrook's nephew in Australia. And when did those 2 years expire? Asked Inspector Slack sharply. Last week, October the 8th, to be precise. Mrs. Carisbrook became absolute owner of the property on that date. She was free to do as she wished, sell it, leave England, whatever she chose. And the estate is worth? Approximately £15,000, Inspector, a considerable sum. Inspector Slack's eyes narrowed. Who knew about this provision? It was not a secret. Mr. Geoffrey Linton, as the estate agent managing the properties, was certainly aware of it. I believe Mrs. Carisbrook had discussed it with Miss Bryce in her letters. As for others, well, such matters have a way of becoming known in a village. Geoffrey Linton, when questioned, admitted readily that he had known about the 2-year provision. He also admitted, with less readiness, that he had been the Colonel's business partner in Egypt and that there had been a disagreement about finances shortly before the Colonel's death. But I had nothing to do with his death, Linton protested. It was a drowning, a tragic accident, and I certainly had no reason to harm Mrs. Carisbrook. She was my client. I managed her properties. And were paid for doing so, observed Inspector Slack. A nice steady income, Mr. Linton. How did you feel about the possibility that she might sell everything and take her business elsewhere? Linton's pleasant face flushed. That's absurd. I had no reason. I wouldn't. But his protests seemed hollow even to his own ears. Eleanor Bryce, summoned from the Blue Boar, was pale and shaking. She confirmed that Lydia Carisbrook had written to her about discovering something terrible concerning her husband's death in Cairo. She said she had proof, Eleanor whispered. Proof that it was not an accident. She was going to confront someone, she did not say who, and then she would go to the authorities. She asked me to come to St. Mary Mead because she needed a friend, someone who had known them both, to advise her. And did she mention, asked Inspector Slack carefully, what form this proof took? She said there were papers, documents. She had them in a London bank, she said, but she was bringing copies with her. A search of Mrs. Carisbrook's belongings revealed no such papers. Her travelling bag, examined minutely, yielded only personal items and one photograph. The Colonel, with Geoffrey Linton and an Egyptian gentleman, taken at what appeared to be a warehouse. On the back, in the Colonel's handwriting, with Linton and Ahmed Pasha, the last honest day. Inspector Slack studied the photograph with great interest. The last honest day, he repeated. Now what do you suppose he meant by that? Miss Marple, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the drawing-room, spoke for the first time in several minutes. I wonder, Inspector, whether you have considered the significance of the chair. The chair? Slack frowned. Which chair? The one that faces away from the door. It suggests, does it not, that someone wished to remain concealed while watching the lane, but also while listening for sounds within the house itself. Someone who was waiting, Inspector. Waiting for Mrs. Carisbrook to arrive so that they might... She paused delicately. Well, so that they might prevent her from revealing whatever she had discovered. The October afternoon was fading into evening, and the shadows in old Carisbrook House seemed to grow longer and darker. Inspector Slack looked around the dusty drawing-room, at the chair that faced the wrong way, at the desk with its unfinished letter, and he felt the weight of what had happened here pressing upon him. This was not an accident. This was murder, carefully planned and coldly executed. Someone had waited in this house in the darkness, had confronted Lydia Carisbrook by candlelight, and had pushed her to her death to prevent her from speaking a truth that someone desperately needed to keep hidden. The question now was not whether murder had been done, but who had done it, and what secret was worth killing to conceal. Chapter 5. The investigation deepens. The telegram arrived from Cairo 3 days after the investigation had been formally opened. Inspector Slack read it with considerable satisfaction, then motored immediately to St. Mary Mead to share its contents with Dr. Haydock and, somewhat reluctantly, with Miss Marple. They gathered in the doctor's consulting room, a comfortable book-lined chamber that smelled faintly of leather and carbolic. Inspector Slack spread the telegram on the desk. "The Cairo police have been most helpful," he said. "Colonel Carisbrook's death was ruled accidental drowning in the Nile 2 years ago this past August. However, there had been what they call irregularities in his business affairs. The cotton export venture was run by 3 partners, Colonel Carisbrook, Geoffrey Linton, and a third man who went by the name Ahmed Pasha. Some £15,000 had gone missing from their joint account in the weeks before the colonel's death." "3 partners," murmured Miss Marple. "How interesting." Indeed. The Egyptian authorities investigated, but the matter was complicated by the fact that the colonel was attempting to determine which of his associates was responsible. He suspected the embezzlement came from within the partnership, but the records had been cleverly manipulated. 2 days after the colonel began his investigation in earnest, he drowned. Geoffrey Linton left Egypt shortly thereafter, and this Ahmed Pasha fellow disappeared entirely, left the country within the week. Dr. Haydock leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. So any one of the 3 could have been the embezzler, and if Mrs. Carisbrook discovered proof of who it was? "Precisely," said Inspector Slack with grim satisfaction. "She would represent a danger to someone, a danger that needed to be silenced." Miss Marple, who had been knitting quietly throughout this exchange, looked up with her mild, thoughtful expression. "I wonder," she said gently, "whether you have made inquiries into Mr. Linton's financial situation." "As a matter of fact, I have," said the inspector. "His estate agency is failing. He's heavily in debt, gambling mostly. He owes money to several quite unsavory characters in London." "Dear me," said Miss Marple, "how very unfortunate for him." But it was the information about Eleanor Bryce that proved most illuminating. A second telegram, this one from the British consulate in Cairo, revealed that Miss Eleanor Bryce had indeed been in Egypt at the time of Colonel Carisbrook's death. She had been companion to a Lady Westhaven who had died there of fever. But, and this was the significant detail, Eleanor had been dismissed from Lady Westhaven's service 3 weeks before that lady's death, under circumstances that suggested some impropriety. More intriguingly, the consulate records showed that Eleanor Bryce had been seen in the company of Colonel Carisbrook on several occasions during his final week in Cairo. They had been observed dining together at Shepherd's Hotel, and she had visited the warehouse offices. When confronted with this information, Eleanor Bryce broke down completely. She received Inspector Slack in her small room at the Blue Boar, her face pale and her hands trembling. "I suppose you must know everything now," she said in a low voice. "Yes, I saw Eustace, Colonel Carisbrook, in Cairo. We had known each other long ago before his marriage. When I encountered him there, it seemed as though fate had given us a second chance." "A second chance?" prompted Inspector Slack. "He was unhappy in his marriage. Lydia had never understood him. He told me he had made a terrible mistake. We talked of the future, of what might be possible when—" She broke off, her eyes filling with tears. "When his wife was out of the way," suggested Inspector Slack harshly. "No, it was not like that. Eustace would never have—" He spoke of divorce, perhaps, or separation. But then he discovered the missing money and he became obsessed with it. He was convinced one of his partners had been stealing from the business. He told me he was determined to find out which one. He had his suspicions, but he needed proof. Documents, bank statements, shipping records. He was going through everything systematically. And did he find his proof? I don't know. That was the last time I saw him alive. 3 days later he was dead, and I fled Egypt in terror. I thought I was afraid that I might be suspected, you see. We had been seen together, and I knew how it would look. Did Colonel Carisbrook tell you whom he suspected? Asked Inspector Slack. Eleanor shook her head. He mentioned names, Linton, certainly, and the other partner, Ahmed Pasha. He said he was checking the accounts associated with each of them, but he would not tell me his conclusions. He said it was better if I knew nothing, for my own protection. It was the Reverend Paul Denham whose testimony provided another piece of the puzzle. He came to the vicarage study at Miss Marple's gentle suggestion, looking pale and troubled. "I have been wrestling with my conscience," he admitted to Inspector Slack. "Mrs. Carisbrook did write to me requesting a meeting. She said—" He paused, clearly distressed. "She said she wished to make a confession about a matter that had weighed upon her conscience for 2 years. She would not elaborate in writing, but I gathered it concerned her husband's death." "And you met with her?" "No, that is the dreadful thing. I wrote back suggesting she call at the vicarage on the evening of October 15th, but I was called away to attend a sick parishioner in Much Benham. I left a note for her at the vicarage, but I suppose she never received it. I returned late that evening and learned the next morning of her death." "Can anyone confirm your whereabouts that evening?" asked Inspector Slack sharply. "Mrs. Elkins in Much Benham. I sat with her husband until past 9 o'clock. He died shortly after midnight." Miss Marple had paid a visit to the chemist's shop in the High Street, ostensibly to purchase some headache powders. She emerged with more than medicine. Mr. Parsons, the chemist, was a garrulous man, much given to conversation, and Miss Marple's gentle questions about the various colognes and toilet waters he stocked elicited interesting information. "Bay rum now, Miss Marple? Not much call for it these days. Old-fashioned, really. I've sold perhaps 2 bottles in the past year. One to Mr. Geoffrey Linton, rather particular about his grooming, is Mr. Linton. Expensive tastes for a man in his position, if you ask me. And one to a gentleman from London, or so I took him to be from his manner of speaking. He came through on the train about a month ago and stopped in to make a purchase. Said the London shops had run out of his preferred brand. Tall fellow, well-spoken. I remember thinking he looked more like a clergyman than anything else." Miss Marple made sympathetic noises and purchased a small bottle of lavender water. That evening, she returned to Old Carisbrook House with Inspector Slack's permission. She stood for a long time in the hallway, her eyes moving from the writing desk to the stairs to the drawing room where the oddly positioned chair still stood. Then she climbed the stairs slowly, her hand on the banister, and entered the front bedroom where someone had waited and watched. The window gave a clear view of the lane. Anyone approaching the house would be visible for several minutes before they reached the door. Miss Marple stood there as the autumn twilight deepened, thinking of someone who had stood here 2 weeks ago, watching and waiting. In Mrs. Carisbrook's traveling bag, which Inspector Slack had allowed her to examine, Miss Marple found something the police had overlooked, or perhaps had dismissed as insignificant. Tucked into the lining was a small slip of paper, a receipt from a London bank for a safe deposit box. The date on the receipt was October 14th, the day before Mrs. Carisbrook died. She had been to the bank, Miss Marple said to Inspector Slack later. She collected something from the safe deposit box. The documents, I imagine, the proof she meant to use. "But we found no such documents," objected Inspector Slack. "No," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "We did not, which suggests, does it not, that the murderer found them first?" As she walked home through the gathering darkness, Miss Marple found herself thinking about human nature and the lengths to which people would go to protect themselves. £15,000 was a great deal of money, and the threat of exposure for embezzlement and murder would be a powerful motive indeed. But there were other motives too. Fear, perhaps, of being implicated in another's crime, or the desperate need to protect a secret that should have remained buried. The October wind stirred the fallen leaves along the lane, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked. Miss Marple drew her coat more closely about her and quickened her pace. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but the picture they formed was not yet complete. There was something she was missing, some small detail that would make everything clear, and until she found it, a murderer walked free in St. Mary Mead. Chapter 6. Unraveling Threads. Miss Marple sat in her comfortable sitting room on a grey October afternoon, her knitting needles moving with their customary rhythm. The fire burned cheerfully in the grate, and on the table beside her lay several items that might have seemed incongruous to a casual observer. The bank receipt found in Mrs. Carisbrook's bag, a small notebook in which she had been making careful notes, and the photograph of Colonel Carisbrook with Geoffrey Linton and Ahmed Pasha in Cairo. Mrs. Bantry had called that morning, full of the latest village gossip. Their conversation had proved most illuminating, though not in ways that Mrs. Bantry herself had recognized. "The whole village is talking of nothing else," Mrs. Bantry had said. "And I must say, Jane, I cannot understand why Inspector Slack hasn't simply arrested Geoffrey Linton. The man was in debt, he was one of the partners with access to that money, and he clearly had every reason to want Mrs. Carisbrook silenced." Miss Marple had merely smiled her gentle smile and made a remark about how things were not always as simple as they appeared. It had reminded her, she said, of the case of Tommy Bond and the stolen church collection. Tommy Bond? Mrs. Bantry had looked puzzled. But wasn't he the one who claimed he saw a ghost in the churchyard? Indeed, yes. And everyone believed there must be some supernatural explanation, when in fact Tommy had been hiding there himself to smoke cigarettes and had seen his own shadow. People often fail to see the obvious, I find, especially when they are looking for something more complicated. Now, alone with her thoughts, Miss Marple considered the case methodically. The physical evidence was clear enough. Mrs. Carisbrook had been pushed to her death. Someone had waited in the house for her arrival. That someone had possessed a key to the property or had known where to find one. The bay rum cologne was significant. Mr. Parsons had confirmed that he'd sold it to Geoffrey Linton and to a gentleman from London who looked like a clergyman. And yet, Miss Marple's needles paused. The scent she had detected at old Carisbrook House had been faint, old perhaps. Had it been from the night of the murder, or from an earlier visit? She rose and went to her small writing desk, where she extracted a letter she'd received that morning from a friend in London. A friend who had, at Miss Marple's request, made certain inquiries at the bank where Mrs. Carisbrook had maintained her safe deposit box. The letter confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected. Mrs. Carisbrook had indeed visited the bank on October 14th and had removed documents from her box. The bank clerk remembered her particularly because she had seemed agitated and had asked for an envelope in which to seal the papers. She had been quite specific about wanting a strong envelope, one that could not be easily torn. But no such envelope had been found among Mrs. Carisbrook's possessions. Miss Marple returned to her chair and took up her knitting once more. Her mind went back to the unfinished letter. "My dearest Eleanor, I cannot keep silent any longer." Could not keep silent? About what? About the embezzlement, certainly. About which of the three partners had stolen the money. But was that all? She thought about Eleanor Bryce, sad, faded Eleanor, who had loved the Colonel and lost him, who had been in Cairo when he died, who had fled in fear afterwards. Fear of what? Miss Marple murmured aloud to herself. Fear of being suspected, or fear of something else entirely? That afternoon she paid a visit to Martha Briggs. The former housekeeper received her in her small cottage with evident pleasure. Miss Marple had brought some of her special plum preserves, and over tea the conversation turned naturally to old Carisbrook House. "You mentioned, Martha, that you found a drawer forced open in the Colonel's study," Miss Marple said gently. "About a month ago, was it not?" "That's right, Miss Marple. The lock was broken, and Mr. Linton said, as I must have been mistaken, that it had been like that all along. But I knew better. I'd dusted that desk many a time when the Colonel was alive. And what did the Colonel keep in that particular drawer? Martha frowned, trying to remember. Business papers, I think. Letters from Egypt. He was very particular about that drawer being kept locked. And when you found it forced open, was anything missing? I couldn't rightly say, Miss Marple. It wasn't my place to go through the Colonel's papers. But the drawer was empty, I do know that. Quite empty. Miss Marple paused, then said delicately, "There's one other matter, Martha, that puzzles me rather. You have a key to the house, do you not, for your monthly airings?" "Yes, Miss Marple. I keep it on a ring with my other keys." "Has it ever gone missing, even briefly?" Martha set down her teacup with a clatter. "Now that you mention it, Miss Marple, there was something odd about 5 weeks back. I couldn't find my key ring for a whole day. I was quite put out about it. I searched everywhere, turned the cottage upside down. Then the next morning, there it was in my apron pocket, which was strange because I'd already checked that pocket twice the day before. I thought I was going daft. "Someone borrowed it," said Miss Marple gently. "Borrowed it and returned it before you could raise an alarm." Martha's face went pale. "But who would do such a thing? And why?" "That," said Miss Marple, "is indeed the question. Did you tell anyone about your monthly visits to air the house?" "Well, I suppose I might have mentioned it in passing. The Reverend Denham was very kind last month. Helped me carry some heavy supplies up to the house when I went to do my airing. Such a thoughtful young man. I remember saying to him how grateful I was, as the walk is. Rather long, and my rheumatism does trouble me." "The Reverend Denham helped you?" Miss Marple's needles stilled. "Oh, yes. Very obliging he was. Carried everything right into the kitchen for me and waited while I opened all the windows. Said he didn't mind at all. And what was the good of being young and strong if you couldn't help your neighbors?" Miss Marple filed this information away, carefully. The Reverend Denham had been to the house. He knew Martha had a key. He would have observed where she kept it, perhaps even had opportunity to note which key opened the front door. She made one more visit that day, this time to the vicarage. The vicar's wife was delighted to see her and immediately produced tea and seed cake. Their conversation ranged over various parish matters before Miss Marple gently turned it to the subject of the Reverend Paul Denham. "Such a conscientious young man," said the vicar's wife warmly, "always so concerned about his duties. He quite wore himself out visiting Mrs. Elkins's husband on the night poor Mrs. Carisbrook died. He didn't return until nearly midnight, you know." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "Mrs. Elkins lives in Much Benham, does she not?" "Yes, though it's the near side of Much Benham, only about 3 miles. Still, a long way to bicycle at night, especially when one is already tired." He went by bicycle. "Oh, yes. The young curate doesn't run to a motor car, I'm afraid. Though I must say—" She paused, looking troubled. "Yes?" prompted Miss Marple gently. "Well, it did seem odd that his bicycle had a punctured tire the next morning. He mentioned it at breakfast, said he must have run over something sharp on the way home. But the roads are generally quite good around here." Miss Marple returned home as the autumn dusk was falling. She sat for a long time by her window, watching the shadows lengthen across her garden. Her mind assembled and reassembled the pieces of the puzzle, the forced drawer, the missing documents, the borrowed key, the punctured bicycle tire, the cologne purchased by a London gentleman who looked like a clergyman, the envelope that had disappeared. And then there was the photograph. She picked it up and studied it once more. Colonel Carisbrook, Geoffrey Linton, and Ahmed Pasha standing before a warehouse. "The last honest day," the colonel had written. The last honest day, before the embezzlement was discovered, or before something else. Miss Marple thought about human nature, about greed and fear, about the desperate measures people took to protect themselves and those they loved. She thought about village parallels and recurring patterns. She thought about Tommy Bond seeing his own shadow and believing it was a ghost. Sometimes, she reflected, people failed to see the obvious because they were looking in the wrong direction entirely. They saw one suspect when there might be another. They assumed guilt where there was perhaps only fear. They looked for complicated motives when the simplest one might be the truth. The October evening deepened into night, and still Miss Marple sat thinking. By the time she rose to light her lamp, she had reached a conclusion. She knew who had murdered Mrs. Carisbrook, and she thought she knew why. But she would need proof, or rather, she would need to arrange matters so that the murderer revealed himself. She sat down at her writing desk and began to compose a note to Inspector Slack. It was time, she thought, for a gathering. Time for all the principals in this sad affair to be brought together so that the truth might finally be told. Her pen moved steadily across the paper, and as she wrote, she thought of that cry in the candlelight, that last terrified sound that had echoed through the October darkness. Mrs. Carisbrook had cried out because she had seen her murderer's face and known her danger. But she had also, in that final moment, understood the full extent of the deception that had been practiced upon her. The truth, Miss Marple had always found, had a way of coming to light eventually. And tomorrow, in the quiet drawing-room of the vicarage, it would come to light at last. Chapter 7. The Cairo Connection. The response from the Cairo authorities arrived by special courier on a grey November morning. Inspector Slack read through the documents with mounting satisfaction, occasionally making notes in his official notebook. Dr. Haydock, who had been summoned to join him, watched with keen interest. "This is most illuminating," said Inspector Slack at length, "most illuminating indeed. The Egyptian police have been extremely thorough." The documents confirmed what had been suspected, but not proven. Colonel Eustace Carisbrook had indeed confronted his business partners about missing funds on the 23rd of August, 2 years previously. A clerk at the cotton warehouse remembered the meeting. The colonel had called all three partners together: himself, Geoffrey Linton, and the man known as Ahmed Pasha. He had announced that £15,000 was missing from the accounts, and he intended to discover who had taken it. But more interesting still were the shipping records. These showed discrepancies in manifests that had been signed by Ahmed Pasha: cargo listed but never shipped, payments received for cotton that had never left the warehouse. The pattern suggested systematic theft over a period of months. "So it was this Ahmed Pasha fellow," said Dr. Haydock. "Not Linton at all." "It would appear so, and there's more." Inspector Slack shuffled through the papers. "The Egyptian authorities have located a boatman who remembers being approached by an Englishman, answering to Ahmed Pasha's description, who asked detailed questions about the currents in the Nile near where the colonel's body was found. This was 3 days before the drowning." "Premeditation," murmured Dr. Haydock. "Without question. And here's the final piece of evidence. The colonel's banker in Cairo has come forward. It seems that on the day before his death, Colonel Carisbrook withdrew a large sum in cash, not for investment, but to repay certain business debts. The banker has a copy of the colonel's will lodged with him for safekeeping. In it, there's a codicil added just days before the colonel died. He states explicitly that if anything should happen to him under suspicious circumstances, his papers regarding the embezzlement, held in a London bank, should be examined by the authorities." Inspector Slack set down the documents and looked at Dr. Haydock with grim satisfaction. "So Mrs. Carisbrook must have found these papers. That's why she came to St. Mary Mead, to confront someone with the evidence of both embezzlement and murder." That afternoon, Inspector Slack paid a visit to Geoffrey Linton at his office in the village. The estate agent received him with less than his customary pleasant manner, his face pale and tense. "More questions, Inspector?" "I have here evidence that places you in Cairo at the time of Colonel Carisbrook's death, Mr. Linton, despite your earlier claims to the contrary." The colour drained from Linton's face. For a moment he seemed about to deny it, then his shoulders sagged. "Very well," he said quietly. "I was there. I lied about the dates because I was terrified of being implicated, but I did not kill the Colonel, and I certainly didn't kill Mrs. Carisbrook." "Tell me what happened," said Inspector Slack. Linton took a deep breath. The Colonel discovered money was missing, £15,000. He called all three partners together, myself, Ahmed Pasha, and himself. The Colonel said one of us had stolen it, and he was going to find out who. I had borrowed some money from the partnership, with intention to repay it, I swear. But this was different. This was systematic theft on a grand scale. I was terrified he would think it was me. And Ahmed Pasha. He seemed equally shocked, but 2 days later the Colonel confronted Ahmed specifically. I overheard part of their argument, something about falsified shipping records that pointed to Ahmed. The Colonel had bank statements, manifests. He said he had proof. The next day, the Colonel drowned. Ahmed left Egypt within the week. I stayed, yes, because I was afraid. If I ran, it would look like guilt. And what of Mrs. Carisbrook's letter asking to meet you? I never received such a letter, Inspector. I swear it. If she wrote to me, it never arrived. The first I knew of her being in St. Mary Mead was when they found her body. Inspector Slack studied him carefully. There was a ring of truth to his words, or perhaps he was simply an excellent liar. You borrowed money from the partnership. How much? £2,000. I was in financial difficulties, gambling debts. I intended to repay it from commissions on property sales, but business was slow. When the Colonel began investigating the accounts, I confessed immediately to the borrowing. He was angry, but he said we would work out a repayment scheme. It was the larger theft that consumed him, the 15,000 that had been systematically stolen over months. And you never suspected Ahmed Pasha? Not until the Colonel showed me the evidence. Ahmed was, well, he seemed respectable enough. A businessman who had adopted local customs. We never questioned his background. After Linton had been dismissed with stern warnings to remain available for questioning, Inspector Slack returned to Much Benham Station. There he found Miss Marple waiting in his office with an air of quiet determination. "I have been thinking about the bicycle," she said without preamble. "The bicycle?" Inspector Slack looked puzzled. "The Reverend Denham's bicycle. He mentioned having a punctured tire on the morning after Mrs. Carisbrook's death. I made some inquiries at the bicycle shop in the village. The puncture was in the rear tire, and it was caused by a small nail, the sort of nail one might pick up on a country lane." "I'm not sure I follow your meaning, Miss Marple." "Merely that the lane leading to Old Carisbrook House is surfaced with gravel, not dirt. There would be very few loose nails lying about, but there might be nails if someone had been doing work. I spoke with Martha Briggs, and she mentioned that the garden shed at Old Carisbrook House had a broken hasp on the door. Someone had forced it open recently. She noticed it on her last visit to air the house." Inspector Slack's eyes narrowed. "You think Denham went to the house?" "I think," said Miss Marple gently, "that someone wished us to believe he did not. A punctured bicycle tire is a very convenient explanation for not having ridden somewhere. And yet the vicar's wife mentioned that Reverend Denham returned quite late that evening, near midnight. Much Benham is only 3 miles away. Even allowing for time at the sickbed, it seems rather a long absence." She paused, her knitting needles clicking softly. "There is also the matter of the envelope. Mrs. Carisbrook obtained a strong envelope from the bank to hold her documents. Where is it now? Not among her possessions at the house. Perhaps whoever took the documents kept the envelope as well, not realizing it might be traced." Inspector Slack sat back in his chair, his mind working rapidly. "I think we need to have another conversation with Reverend Denham." "I think that would be very wise, Inspector." That evening, a telegram arrived from Cairo in response to Miss Marple's inquiry about Ahmed Pasha's identity. Inspector Slack read it with considerable interest before immediately taking it to show Dr. Haydock. "Ahmed Pasha has been identified," he said grimly. British citizen, born Paul Denham, left England 15 years ago under a cloud of financial irregularities. Married an Egyptian woman, had a son. The son would now be in his late 20s. Ahmed Pasha, Paul Denham Sr., died in Cairo 2 years ago of heart failure, shortly after Colonel Carisbrook's death. Denham, repeated Dr. Haydock slowly. And our young curate is also named Denham. Quite a coincidence, said Inspector Slack dryly, though I wonder if it's a coincidence at all. A son would have every reason to protect his father's name, every reason to ensure that evidence of his father's crimes never came to light. But the curate only arrived in St. Mary Mead recently, objected Dr. Haydock. How would he have known about Mrs. Carisbrook's investigation? Perhaps, said Miss Marple quietly, for she had accompanied the inspector. He came here precisely because he knew. Because his father, before dying, confessed everything and told him where the colonel had lived. A son, trying to protect his father's memory, might go to great lengths to find and destroy any evidence of his crimes. Inspector Slack looked at the telegram once more. We'll bring him in tomorrow morning. Gently, mind you. We have suspicions, but we need proof. Or, better yet, he glanced at Miss Marple. We need a confession. As she walked home through the November darkness, Miss Marple reflected on the sadness of it all. A young man burdened with his father's sins, driven to murder to keep those sins hidden. Mrs. Carisbrook had died, not because of what she had done, but because of what she knew, and because she had insisted on bringing that knowledge to light. The autumn wind stirred the bare branches overhead, and the village lights seemed very distant. Justice was necessary, Miss Marple thought, but it brought no joy. Only the satisfaction of truth revealed and wickedness brought to account. Tomorrow would bring the final reckoning. Tomorrow, in the vicarage drawing room, all would be made clear. Chapter 8. A Gathering at the Vicarage. The vicarage drawing room had been arranged with particular care. Tea had been laid out on the sideboard, though no one present seemed inclined to partake of it. The grey November afternoon pressed against the windows, and the fire burned brightly in the grate, casting flickering shadows across the assembled company. Inspector Slack stood near the door, his notebook at the ready. Dr. Haydock occupied a chair by the fireplace. The vicar himself sat somewhat uncomfortably at his own desk, clearly uncertain of his role in these proceedings, and in the centre of the room, occupying the various chairs and settees, were the principals in the case. Geoffrey Linton, pale but composed, Eleanor Bryce, her handkerchief clutched in trembling hands, the Reverend Paul Denham, his young face grave and troubled, and Martha Briggs, who kept glancing nervously at the door as though contemplating flight. Miss Marple sat in her customary quiet manner, her knitting in her lap, her eyes moving thoughtfully from face to face. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. I've asked you all here because Miss Marple believes she can shed light on Mrs. Carisbrook's death. Miss Marple, perhaps you would care to begin. Miss Marple looked up with her gentle smile. Thank you, Inspector. I wonder if I might tell you all a little story first. It concerns a case that happened some years ago in this very village. A man named Mr. Harmon was suspected of murdering his wife for her modest inheritance. The evidence against him was considerable. He had opportunity, he had motive, and witnesses had seen him near the scene of the crime. But there was one detail that troubled me at the time. She paused, her needles clicking softly. Mr. Harmon was a creature of habit, you see. Every Thursday evening without fail, he visited the public house. Yet on the Thursday his wife died. He claimed to have stayed home. The alibi that should have proved his innocence actually suggested his guilt, because it was out of character. A truly innocent man would have followed his normal routine. Eleanor Bryce shifted in her seat, and Miss Marple's gentle gaze rested upon her before moving to the young curate. I found myself thinking about that case when I considered poor Mrs. Carisbrook's death. We have been looking, you see, at people who had reasons to want her silenced. Mr. Linton certainly appeared to have much to fear. But there was someone else, someone whose behavior was curiously out of character. She turned to the Reverend Denham. "You told Inspector Slack that you were at Mrs. Elkins's bedside in Much Benham on the evening of the murder, a sick call that lasted until nearly midnight. Most commendable. And yet the vicar's wife mentioned that you had a punctured bicycle tire the next morning. A curious coincidence, don't you think? A puncture that provided a convenient explanation for why no one could examine whether you had actually made that long journey." The young curate's face had gone very white. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," said Miss Marple gently, "that you were at old Carisbrook House that evening, that you met Mrs. Carisbrook there by arrangement, and that during your meeting something happened which resulted in her death." "That's absurd." Denham's voice shook. "I was in Much Benham. Mrs. Elkins will confirm it." "Mrs. Elkins was very ill, I understand. Barely conscious. She would hardly have noticed whether you were there for 2 hours or 20 minutes. Geoffrey Linton had been listening with growing attention. "But why? What possible motive could Denham have?" "The same motive you were suspected of having, Mr. Linton," said Miss Marple quietly. "Fear of exposure. You see, the bay rum cologne troubled me from the beginning. Mr. Parsons mentioned that he had sold a bottle not only to you, but to a gentleman from London about a month ago, a tall, well-spoken man who looked rather like a clergyman. At the time, I thought little of it, but our young curate had only recently arrived in St. Mary Mead, from London," she continued, her voice measured and calm. "And then there was the matter of access to the house. The vicar's wife mentioned that Reverend Denham had kindly helped Martha carry supplies to old Carisbrook House. He would have seen where she kept her keys. Martha later told me her key ring went missing for an entire day, then mysteriously reappeared in her apron pocket. Someone had borrowed it." Miss Marple picked up the photograph from the table beside her. "I think if we examine this photograph carefully, the one showing the Colonel with Mr. Linton and Ahmed Pasha, we might understand everything. Inspector Slack made inquiries in Cairo, and Ahmed Pasha has been identified. He was not Egyptian at all, but English. A businessman who had changed his name and appearance. His real name was Paul Denham." The silence in the room was absolute. Eleanor Bryce gasped, and Martha Briggs stared at the curate with dawning horror. "My father," said Reverend Denham at last, his voice barely audible. "Ahmed Pasha was my father." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, "and Colonel Carisbrook discovered that your father was involved in the embezzlement. Not Mr. Linton at all, though I suspect Mr. Linton may have known or guessed the truth and kept silent to protect his own reputation. The Colonel had evidence, you see. Documents that proved your father had stolen the money and arranged the Colonel's death when confronted with his crimes." Denham sat motionless for a long moment, then spoke in a voice devoid of emotion. "My father died in Cairo 2 years ago, within months of the Colonel's death. I was already in seminary when it happened. I'd been estranged from him for years after discovering his criminal activities. I took my mother's maiden name, Denham, when I entered theological college 5 years ago. I wanted nothing to do with his corruption." He paused, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "But when he died, his solicitor sent me a letter my father had written on his deathbed. In it, he confessed to embezzling from the Colonel and to arranging the Colonel's death. He begged me to destroy certain documents he'd hidden to protect what remained of our family name. He said the Colonel had kept evidence in his London bank, and that one day it might surface." "So you came to St. Mary Mead?" said Miss Marple gently. "Yes. I took the curacy here specifically because I learned the Colonel had lived in this village. I needed to find those documents my father mentioned. I borrowed Martha's key and searched the house. I found the Colonel's desk drawer and forced it open, but it was empty. Someone else had already taken the papers." "Mrs. Carisbrook," said Inspector Slack. "Yes. When she wrote asking to meet, saying she had discovered the truth about her husband's death, I knew she must have found them. I thought—" I hoped I could appeal to her mercy, explain that my father was dead, that exposing him would only hurt me and accomplish nothing. I met her at old Carisbrook House instead of the vicarage. I couldn't risk being seen with her. I tried to explain. I told her my father had been desperate, that he had never meant for events to spiral out of control. His voice broke. But she wouldn't listen. She said justice mattered more than mercy, that the truth must come out regardless of the consequences. I panicked. I grabbed her shoulders to make her understand, but she pulled away and she fell. He buried his face in his hands. I didn't mean to kill her. I swear I didn't. But when she fell, I knew no one would believe it was an accident. So I took the envelope with the documents and destroyed them. I arranged things to look as though she had come alone and fallen in the darkness. I thought it was over. Inspector Slack moved forward, but Miss Marple held up a gentle hand. The envelope, Inspector. I believe if you search the garden shed at old Carisbrook House, you may find it hidden there. Mr. Denham could not risk being seen disposing of it. As Inspector Slack led the young curate away, the room remained in stunned silence. Geoffrey Linton sat with his head in his hands, while Eleanor Bryce wept quietly. Martha Briggs had gone quite pale. Miss Marple gathered up her knitting and spoke quietly to the vicar. "I'm very sorry. I know this must be terribly distressing." The vicar nodded, unable to speak. As she walked home through the November dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the tragedy of it all. A young man, trying to protect his father's memory, had destroyed himself through one moment of panic and fear. Mrs. Carisbrook had died not for money or jealousy, but because she had insisted on seeking justice for her husband's death. The vicar caught up with her at her garden gate. "How did you know?" he asked quietly. Miss Marple paused, looking up at the darkening sky. It was the scent of bay rum at old Carisbrook House. Everyone assumed it meant Mr. Linton had been there recently. But Mr. Linton is a vain man who would never allow his cologne to fade. The scent I detected was old, faint, as though someone wearing it had been in the house weeks earlier, when the drawer was forced. And when Mr. Parsons mentioned the London gentleman who looked like a clergyman, I began to wonder. She smiled sadly. People imagine wickedness is loud and violent, but it so often comes with the softest of footsteps. And sometimes, Vicar, just a cry in the candlelight. The autumn roses in her garden were finished now, their petals fallen, but Miss Marple knew that spring would come again, and with it, new blooms. Life continued its natural course, even after tragedy. Justice had been served, truth had prevailed, and St. Mary Mead could return to its peaceful rhythms once more. And so, the last candle flickers out in old Carisbrook House, and another mystery returns to its shelf in the hidden library. The truth has come to light, woven from grief, greed, and the desperate silence of those who feared it most. If this tale held you in its spell, leave a like and subscribe for more lost stories waiting to be uncovered. Until we meet again, keep your curiosity alive, your wits sharp, and remember, within the hidden library, every whisper hides a story longing to be found.